Right, good morning everyone. My name is Ashley Irons and I'm going to be speaking about writing reports, and if there's time, which there probably won't be, about how to give evidence. I've got a whole load of slides which I think you're going to be able to access. I've been involved in the writing of reports, or rather marking them as it were, putting them right, telling people what they should do. And then I also am in court a lot dealing with witnesses who say, who wrote this report? They never asked me. I don't agree with that. So what I'd like to know is how many of you are likely to be giving evidence in court, because if it's hardly anybody, I can just leave that out and you can pick up the slides later. But I can do the opposite. So how many of you, put your hands up, are actually likely to be in a tribunal or a court? Okay, so it's not many. So we'll have to see how we go, because there's lots of tricks of the trade, particularly in answering questions. It's not rocket science, but of course, like many things in life, it's easier to tell people what to do than to do it yourself. And I spend a lot of my time with witnesses training them to give evidence, because what's important is for witnesses to be able to be assertive, to say what they want to say, not what somebody's trying to egg them on to say. So I'll come back to that. But let's start with SUIs, although the expressions, as with everything else in the health service, changes a lot. SIR is perhaps slightly more current. What is the purpose of an investigation report? Well, the investigation is to gather evidence, isn't it? Establish the facts. It may or may not be a root cause analysis, but I'm not going into that. And it's to learn lessons, really, but there are certain ingredients that are required. So before you put pen to paper, first of all, you've got to assume that any investigation report is going to reach a wider audience. It may not be intended for a wider audience, but we're in, duty of candor and all of that. You should assume that it will reach those that you can't even imagine, not least of which the CQC. Subheadings. It's no good writing a boring looking report because it looks boring and nobody will read it. Can you really anonymize your report? I mean, I think anonymity is a good idea, but it's a matter of preference. You don't need to identify patients by name. There's really no point. So what are the key things you must have in every investigation report? Can I just tell you that according to the timetable, I'm supposed to finish in about 10 minutes, which is not possible. Right. In any investigation, people want to know, well, what's the information base from which you're drawing from? So it's documents and witnesses, background and context, and then there needs to be a chronology. Chronologies are really important, but I see some ridiculous chronologies going back to the Doomsday Book. There is no point. Very often all you need is one going back a few days, but before that maybe some context. Really, this is where you start with a chronology, because nobody can understand a report, its findings or action plans without a sensible chronology. Then you need to deal with whatever the issues are, findings, and then of course there's the actions that flow from that. So that's pretty important. So incident issues. Now, obviously I'm looking at the more serious ones. I'll skip suicide because that's pretty unusual. But if you're looking at assault, for example, well, some patients are very assaultative. So you're looking at, well, were the risks considered and were they recorded? What's the evidence of that in the clinical notes? are assaults foreseeable? They may be. You may or may not be able to do much about it, but you can put in place a care plan that seeks to minimise and preventative steps. Those are the sorts of things with regards to that. If you're an author of an SIR, you may find, for example, if someone's died, you could be a witness in an inquest. But of course, most investigations do not involve people dying, do they? They're much more modest, but they are all opportunities for learning. And that really is the key goal that you're working towards. Now, report authors are desperate to reach conclusions, but sometimes this desperation transcends what information is available. And a weakness is that report authors sometimes feel they have to make a judgment on what occurred, even if the information isn't sufficient. So sometimes it's simply not possible to say whether an incident is due to one thing or another, in which case you say so and explain why. You mustn't come to an unsupported conclusion, because you'll end up in trouble, or more likely other people will end up being less than appreciative. A big weakness with reports is report authors sometimes have an evangelical zeal to find something wrong, whereas actually, usually, a lot of things are being done right. But the lack of balance is very striking. So if something is not done, you're entitled as a report author to put that in, but you've got to put in what was done. Otherwise, it's a dreadful report. And I do see some dreadful ones, including homicide reports from those who ought to know better. Do not judge with the benefit of hindsight. This is a nursing conference. You can only work with the information that you've got at the time. It's no good looking back and say, well, it's bloody obvious that you should have done this then. Well, that's fine, isn't it, if you knew what the eventual outcome was, but you don't. So, if a decision is questioned, what matters? So, often in nursing, as with medics, there's a clinical decision to be made. For example, on the amount of observations for a patient. Is it every 15 minutes? Is it every hour? And what one is looking for example, at an inquest, which is where I spend quite a lot of my time, is, well, what was the thought process behind it? Because very often the clinical notes simply record the decision, but not the weighing up, not the pros and cons, not the thoughts that actually led to a decision. So, sometimes the panel acknowledges, let me have a look. Yes. Do you understand the difference between something that's a causal factor, something that's a contributory factor, and something that's a service issue? I see a right muddle in between all three. So, service issues are identified or recommendations so that they can be addressed. In other words, you can have a service issue which actually didn't have any impact on events, but nevertheless it's an important matter to flag up. Likewise, something that's contributory. Contributory means what it says, but don't go to the NPSA guidance because it's all over the place. Well, you'll read it for yourself. But it's very important to split these up, because if something is a causal factor, you are saying that the result was a direct product of something happening. So, for example, a patient was supposed to be observed, let's say, every 30 minutes on the ward, and it wasn't done. And there's an assault, for example. you would be saying, well, was that absence of the 30 minutes being done actually what led to the assault, or was it something utterly different and that it might have occurred anyway? For example, a sudden flare-up or an argument, which even if it was every 15 minutes wouldn't have made any difference. But poor report authors will say the interval was wrong, or it wasn't done as decided upon, but then leave out, but actually whatever the interval was, it wouldn't have made any difference because it wouldn't have been prevented. And it's that extra bit that's so important. It's the balance that I've been talking about earlier on. You know, you've got to give credit for what was done as well as what was not, but you also have to be realistic as to these circumstances. And I will come back to this. Okay, I will move on. Right, why was something not done? First of all, why would you have a heading like that? Why don't you have a heading which says, was something done? Yeah? And in this one, the writing is hard to read, but I'll read it to you. The MDT had not made a detailed evaluation of risk. This is a real report. There's little evidence of MDT discussion with relapse indicators, and then they say it's a potential causal factor. Well, what the hell does that mean? It's either a causal factor or it isn't. What it means is the panel don't really know, but it looks good. So it's rubbish. So I got hold of it, and this is what it became. There was a re-evaluation of risk. Can you see the difference straight away? They're not made a detailed evaluation of risk, but there's no recognition of what was done. Okay, there was a re-evaluation of risk that led to 10-minute observation. So not only was there an evaluation, something was done as a result of it. This was left out of the report. The reason for this is insufficiently explained. So that deals with, this is another way of putting, there is little evidence of MDT discussion. Well, there may be little evidence, but maybe they happened. Are you with me? I mean, this is really basic, noddy stuff. Neutrality and approach. This is how a report started off. Relatively subtle signs of deterioration of mental state were not recognised. Okay. Because different team members did not share information they had. Now, you know, this doesn't necessarily flow from that. But look how it changed once I got hold of it. The subtle signs of deterioration were recognised. You see, it's the complete opposite. But, well, to some extent, but the absence of it sharing information meant that no one person had all the information available. How different it looks, but it's on exactly the same facts. I mention inquests simply because the kind of cases I get involved in tend to be the more serious ones, but you know, it doesn't matter how major or more modest the incident is, the principles are exactly the same. As with reports for inquests, what is being looked at is whether the risks were known and preventable. We are in a risk business. Unless you tie people up to a wall, you know those old-fashioned cartoons with a beard coming down below someone's ankles, you are in risk, aren't you? That means that things will go wrong. That's what risk management's about. The trouble is too many people refuse to accept that that is inevitable. And the CQC are very keen to say, well, they give the impression that all risks are preventable, which is just not true. But they are, of course, correct in saying that the management of risk and the assessment of risk can always be done better. Not that the resources are always there, but anyway, there we are. So, as with the reports for inquests, what's being looked at is whether risks are known and preventable. Was there a weighing up of the risks? I've used this expression already. The risks and benefits of a particular course of action. It doesn't matter what it is. It might be leave of absence. It might be looking at people, visiting people in the community. How often do you go and visit them? Once a day, twice a day, once a week. What are the risks? Is there any evidence of consideration of risk in the notes? Right, was there an opportunity to intervene in the real world? You know, it's very easy to say, well, someone should have done something, but who's this someone, where were they, and was there a realistic opportunity to do anything? Like the example I gave a little bit earlier, that an incident occurred which was independent of whatever the observations might have been on a ward, for example. Was the incident due to external factors wholly beyond the control of clinicians? Because often incidents are. It's too easy to say that because something happened, let's say on a ward, that therefore it was preventable. It might be, in which case you'd say so, but it might not be, and one needs to consider it and then explain why you reach one conclusion or another. Or is it related to something else, e.g. a fight or illicit drugs? You know, coming back from leave of absence, illicit drugs. Refer to other patients with similar presentations you keep safe. When I have got a doctor, a community psychiatrist giving evidence, let's say a patient's got depression, for example, and they end up killing themselves. It's very easy to say, well, somebody should have done something, that the doctor or the visiting nurse professionals, whoever it is, should have done something else or done more of it. But actually, the same kind of regime of care plan, it is for a great many other patients who do not go on to, for example, harm themselves. And it's really important for that to be said. So whether you are writing a report or whether you're giving evidence, and if there is criticism of whatever the care plan, the regime is, you need to say, well, actually, it works pretty well for 99% of patients, but not on this occasion. That's what risk management is all about. Right, when you finish the final draft, if criticisms are made of staff, are these staff even aware of it? I had a case where a doctor was criticised by, I think it was a psychologist, which you can imagine didn't please him, and he said, well, I never saw the bloody thing. You know, if somebody had asked me, I could have explained the facts, the circumstances, and what was written wouldn't have been. You know, all of this is entirely avoidable, and it's being fair, isn't it, to staff? You really shouldn't be criticising people without them having an opportunity to understand what the issues are and for you as a report author to take them into account. Yes, check for hostages to fortune, inadvertent admissions of negligence or substandard care, sloppy language. Sloppy language is a real issue. What you have to remember is that the time that you spend on a report, well, others may spend an equal amount of time and they may draw from what you say rather different conclusions. And I showed you a couple of examples of the way in which reports that came to me were worded in a certain way, and you can see how they were changed. And yet it says exactly the same thing really, but it says it a lot better. But then I would say that because I revised it. The Crawford case is a great one. It's all to do with a patient who was tied down more or less to a chair, got dementia, and that was to stop him getting up, because when he got up he fell over, and how the investigation panel got it woefully wrong, and the Court of Appeal was scathing about the quality of the investigation, saying the investigators are more interested in covering their own backs than doing a proper investigation. Common errors: reports going beyond the terms of reference, panels making promises about publication, you can't do that. The facts that a panel come across and report should lead the reader of the report to the same conclusion. The conclusion should be a logical end to what one has read beforehand. Do not put in assumptions that are unsupported by facts. That's just lazy. Becoming too attached to an early preliminary view. I do see this a lot with homicide reports. You can just see somebody saying, oh, I think those people are to blame here, and they're not to be shifted from it, which is a real pity. So, an unconscious observer bias. Oh yes, that's not an observer who's unconscious, but there wouldn't be much use really. But there can be bias, and you need to watch it. Making criticisms of individuals without them being given an opportunity. Confusing root causes with contribution or contributory with service shortcomings. That is very common. Unless it directly leads to the outcome, it is not causative and it's not a root cause. And you must not say it is. No causal link between the conclusions in the report and the evidence that sustains it. Sometimes you read a report and it says that this incident was a direct result of that, and yet this bridge that links one with the other is simply not argued out. Not accepting why some evidence is accepted and some rejected. Absence of recognition of context, both lack of balance again. Oh, best practice. I loathe that expression, and not one of you knows what it means. So I'm not even going to ask, because it is some sort of pinnacle against which anybody and everybody has a slightly different view. It is quite pointless. What you're looking at is not the best practice, whatever it means, but rather what would you expect a nurse or a healthcare assistant to reasonably do at the time, given the situation. Jumping to conclusion, mixing fact and opinion, sometimes in the same sentence. Unclear chronology, evangelical mission to find fault. Considering facts that support a conclusion but not those that don't. You know, that's why the chronology is so important. That should be a purely objective gathering together and a sorting out of evidence, and you put it into a chronology and it takes you where it takes you. Speculating, ignoring context, ignoring good practice, telling witness comments that, yeah. Okay, so I'll move on from that, and in a much shorter order, I'll deal with oral evidence, because there are things that one can do to prepare, because what you have to realize is that those asking you questions will have prepared a lot longer than in all likelihood you will have done, and you're at an immediate disadvantage. Common failings: I will be okay, I know the case and I can find my way amongst the records. This is nonsense. Unless you can find things under pressure, you can't find them. And indeed, you can look on a page and you know you're on the right page of whatever the clinical notes are, but you can't find the critical entry, even though you're probably looking at it, and that's due to stress. And I'm coming on to how you deal with that. In preparing for court, what are your 4 to 6 main points? And really 4 is quite sufficient. You want to have made at least, or rather you want to have given your evidence and to have mentioned the 4 main things that you want to say. There's no point writing a list, because if you do, it's far too long. You do need to be clear on the issues that are coming your way. Do not assume that your evidence will be accepted. You have to think about, well, if it's the family, for example, well, what angle will they be coming at? They will ask, well, why wasn't this done? Or why was this done instead of something else? And it's great if you've prepared and you can find the pages in the notes that deal with it. So these are my golden rules. Unfortunately, they're a bit faint. I don't know whether you can read them, but reading and marking documents, yellow and orange only. Well, that's because if you photocopy, sometimes I get notes, and the only thing that I can't read is the very thing that's the most important, because somebody's highlighted it in blue, would you believe? There's one born every minute. Under pressure, witnesses sometimes get to the right page and they can't find the right entry. So really, if you've got clinical notes, you need to get a photocopy of them so that you can highlight them. Cross-reference. Now, I haven't got an example, but I have at the bottom of a ring file, I've got, usually there's 3 or 4 issues in a case. So I have tabbed each issue, but all the tabs are in a row. So I know that if I'm asking, or it crops up about, let's say, risk assessment, I will have a tab with R at the bottom of the page. Every entry of note on risk assessment, I can get to it instantly. And if you're giving evidence, how great is it to, when some smart-ass barrister says to you, well, there's virtually no risk assessments, and you say, well, actually, let me take you to the notes, and you can go through them. Your confidence returns, you give evidence much better, and more to the point, you are saying what you want to say. And that's what preparation is all about. Post-its. Highlighters and post-its are by far the most useful things ever to be invented for those giving evidence. Giving evidence, your main points are a point of refuge. You can repeat what you've said. If you've given a good answer, why would you change it? It's very odd to me that some people do when they don't want to. The pregnant pause trap, it's difficult, I know, but sometimes if somebody asks a question, you give an answer and there's silence, you feel you've got to fill that gap. Don't. If you're happy with your answer, just shut up. If you don't understand the question, don't answer it, because if you give a great answer to a question that's not been asked, it's a terrible answer, isn't it? If you don't understand the question, just say, I don't understand the question. It's not your fault, it's the fault of the questioner. The questioner will have his or her own agenda. That is inevitably the case. I mean, I always represent hospitals, but and mine is always to make sure that there's balance, that there's context, and so on, as well as being fair. And but others will come from a different point of view, and it's not rocket science to figure out what it is. So you must give the evidence that you want to give as honestly as you can manage, given that events sometimes are many months, if not further, before. It is tricky. I was very pleased a week ago. I was at an inquest and I spoke to a couple of nurses, and I kept saying to them, you must finish your answer. Do not for a moment give half an answer and then the coroner seems satisfied with that, or someone else. And you actually think to yourself, you know, I'd really need to add to that, but I'll come back to it later. You never ever will, never. So what you've got to do, and what I was so pleased to see last week, was both of these two nurses saying, before I answer your next question, I just want to add to what I've just been saying. And then they both said, can you repeat the question? Because you'll have forgotten what it is, and it doesn't matter. Yeah, it's really important that if you're on a subject, you deal with it, because once you've left it, you have left it. And nobody minds being asked to repeat a question. It's also a good ruse if you want to give yourself another moment to think about your answer. Questions may have loaded assumptions, so don't answer them. Yeah? Address the loaded assumption first, because otherwise, if you don't, you're almost ratifying the basis on which the question was put. You know, so for example, somebody might say, well, given the absence of risk assessments, if you then go on to answer the question that comes onto it, it's assumed that you accept that there's an absence of risk assessments, whereas what you should be saying is, well, as I've already said, on this day and this day, we did the following assessments. You know, I've put somebody in their proper place. Right, where are we? Oh, several questions at once. Just deal with one at a time. Don't try and memorize all the questions. Yeah. And the last slide is never speculate or guess or make assumptions. You know, you have to stick to the facts. So if you don't know the answer, you just say, I don't know, or I can't remember. Good answers. Much better than having a stab at it and then getting it wrong and spending another 30 minutes unnecessarily in the witness box. Don't give opinions on matters that go beyond your knowledge or, if you like, expertise. And do beware of the same question being asked in different ways around, like, wouldn't you agree with me? Or, well, okay, but is it possible that? You know, if you're happy with your answer, stick with it. Why would you change it? It's inevitable in some hearings that some people won't be thrilled with your evidence. Well, that's too bad, isn't it? You're there to say what you know about the various events. So I'm going to finish it there. I'm sorry it's such a whistle-stop tour, but anyway, that's the time that, well, I've gone beyond it. So I hope you found it helpful on both fronts, even if it's a bit rapid.